Well, good morning. I'm here with Chris Green. Chris, good to see you.
Good to see you, John. Thank you.
Absolutely. Really is always. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the upcoming discussion we're going to be having in Revelation, because you're going to be a part of that, and wanted to ask you a couple questions. And the first
Yeah.
one, I just maybe you could go over a little bit about your own personal history, or how you were brought up with Revelation, the questions, the perplexities, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, yes. It was a key text in the churches that I grew up in,
Hmm.
and it was read entirely as predictive about the end of time, which we were convinced we were living. So the people I grew up around, the people who taught me, I mean, they all expected the coming of Christ, what they would call the rapture, which of course is distinct from the coming of Christ. But at the time, I didn't know how to make those separations. And they expected that at any moment, like truly at any moment. And Revelation was understood as a kind of map of what would unfurl around that event, right? So rapture, which was understood to be named in Revelation 4 with John being caught up to heaven, and then everything that followed that, a kind of step-by-step description of what would follow the rapture. So for those who were left behind, for the world, the unsaved, the weak in faith, so on.
Wow. So how, I'm assuming you don't have that particular perspective now.
I do not, yeah, I do not read Revelation that way now. And I will say, it was a strange way to read, because I think the text itself, Revelation, it's a difficult text for various reasons, of course. And as you know, the history of interpretation shows just how difficult it is, and that many Christian readers have just kind of kept it at arm's length.
Yeah.
We did not. We embraced it, but I don't think we knew what we were doing when we embraced it, because the metaphors in the text, I think, kind of spilled over our our interpretive grid, right? So we had our way of reading, which was, this is some kind of predictive text, some kind of
Right.
map of the end time. But the metaphors in Revelation, I think, were more powerful than we knew they were, and they were doing other work
Hmm.
beside the work that we were doing. So in terms of what I was told about the book, that was mostly just horrifying, terrifying,
Hmm.
created incredible anxiety. But the metaphors themselves, of course, I think they were doing a different work. And that's where the glory of the text is.
Yeah. One of the things, I was brought up in a similar background. I've shared this with a couple of the other people on the panel when I've interviewed them. Um, the church that I grew up in was pastored by a Dallas seminary grad. And not every summer, but many summers, I remember as a young kid, um, he would have visiting professors from Dallas Seminary come in and do a prophecy conference.
Hmm.
So the Walvards, Ryries, people
Oh
like
yeah,
that,
absolutely.
very dispensational,
Absolutely.
um, and very predictive in the way that they read it. And one of the things that just amazes me today, and this didn't occur to me until, really, to be honest, a few years ago. Um, and it had to do with Revelation quotes or refers or alludes to the Old Testament more than any book in the New does.
Yeah.
Even more than Hebrews, and Hebrews is pretty far up there.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
and I never heard anybody talk about the Old Testament when they talked about Revelation,
Yeah.
other than Daniel and maybe a little smattering of Ezekiel, here and there, the
Yeah.
Valley of Dry
Same.
Bones kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that
Same.
was it. And so, like, the connection between what the what Revelation, the unveiling, is doing with the Old Testament, and unveiling through the Old Testament Jesus Christ, was completely lost.
Oh,
Like,
absolutely. Yeah.
never occurred to me, never occurred to my thinking. We just never talked about it.
Yeah. And the Jesus of Revelation was a kind of alter ego to the Jesus of the Gospels in our
Oh
sense.
yeah, yeah. He was like, now I'm glorified, and it's almost like I've left the gym and I've worked out and you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's right.
You
Yeah, I mean,
know?
it was incredibly violent,
Mm,
and the threat of violence hung over everything that was said about the
yeah.
text.
Yeah.
And the goal was to read the text well enough to be someone who could escape the violence, right? So that the violence happened to other people rather than to you.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there was very little sense that this was about Jesus, and certainly
Mm,
not the Jesus of the Gospels.
right. Right. Yeah. Very different. So, what were some of your favorite teachers or books that? Because obviously you have moved, you have journeyed in the way that you see Revelation and try to attempt to interpret it. So, what were some of those significant contributors to your thought?
Yeah, I'm not sure who said it or who I heard say it first or where I read it, but once I made the turn that Revelation is about the Jesus of the Gospels and that it is an apocalypse of that same Jesus who has revealed God to us.
Mm,
Well, the text turned for me. I mean, or I was able to turn to the text differently. So that, and I don't remember who was the person who introduced me to that idea. I mean, in my church and then in Bible school, I was introduced to the same basic reading. I mean, we read Ryrie and Wolford in Bible school too.
yeah.
So I don't know when I first encountered that idea, but that was the major shift for me, that Revelation is truly an unveiling of Jesus, the same one the apostles knew, right? Not an alter ego, but this very one who died for us. And once that happened, of course, I could come at the text a different way, much different spirit, read it in a much different spirit.
Yeah.
But I think it probably wasn't until I did my PhD work and found out that there are actually quite a few Pentecostal scholars who've written about Revelation, both biblical scholars and theologians. So John Christopher Thomas, who was my PhD supervisor, has a commentary on Revelation. He co-authored a commentary with Frank Macchia, who's a Pentecostal theologian, in the Two Horizons series on Revelation, where Chris does the kind of biblical studies aspect of it, and then Frank does the theology. Two of my colleagues now, where I work at Southeastern, have written books on Revelation, Melissa Archer and Robbie Waddell. And as I've reflected on that, I think it's striking that in my tradition, the Pentecostal tradition that I grew up around, which was a kind of fundamentalist evangelical spirituality with an emphasis on the power of the Spirit,
Mm,
Revelation was a central text, I think, for all of us. But many of us who went on to study found we had to grapple with that text. And that's why I think so many of my colleagues end up writing about it, end up writing books or articles about it, wrestling with what that book did to them, right?
mm,
And what it might have done to them. So I think that that's an eye-opening, that was an eye-opening realization for me, that a lot of us have been, I think, traumatized by the way this text was handled. And I
mm,
don't think traumatized is too strong a word. I mean, I think it
yeah.
really was um, used not just oppressively, but invasively, that
Mm,
the text was used to kind of cut us open. And it, the fact that so many Pentecostal scholars, colleagues of mine, have gone on to give their career to working on the text suggests to me that we need a corrective, right? We
yeah.
need alternative ways of reading.
Definitely. Uh, one different from scaring the hell out of you, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean,
And
that's the way it was done. I can remember the movies, the altar calls, all of
yeah,
that. So
that's right. Well, I mean, I think what Bart, Carl Bart, when he was here, he was, I think it was here, he got to hear Billy Graham preach.
mm,
And they had some correspondence before that had gone fairly well. And then Bart was at a Billy Graham event and heard him speak. And afterwards, Bart said, I don't know what that was, but it was not the gospel, because it was violent. And he said he compared it to gunfighting. He said, he was a gunslinger putting people at the point of his gun in the sermon.
wow.
And that spirituality, I think it kind of doesn't matter what tradition you were raised in, Pentecostal or Baptist or whatever. You're going to have been touched by that kind of violent approach, and revelation was ammunition, no pun intended, for that way of reading things,
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of why it's been such a troubling text.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and to begin with metaphors that most people don't recognize, and you're already kind of starting at a disadvantage, so to speak. And
That's
so
right.
you fill in the meaning with.
Yeah, and I don't mean this in some mean-spirited way, but the kind of American evangelicalism that I grew up with is not really literate. I mean, everyone can read, but they're not literary. They have no sense at all of kind of how literature works. They're not people of poetry. They're not people of metaphor. And so Revelation was violent in that sense too, in that it was a kind of literature for which we had no aptitude. We had no taste for it and no skills with handling it. And so some of that is a failure, not just of our church's spirituality, but of our culture's education. Like, we just utterly failed to awaken people the skills for reading that well. The only exception I will say, the major exception of that, I think, is at times in our preaching, via the Psalms or via an Old Testament story, we might get in touch with something poetic and then be able to reach to the apocalypse and draw phrases from it or an image from it. But we couldn't come right at the text and recognize it as poetic and evocative and metaphorical. Like, we lacked whatever the skills needed for that.
Yeah, it's there was a time, believe it or not, because I used to try to avoid Revelation like the plague, but I actually taught for several years in a Bible college, kind of a Bible survey, and I had Hebrews through Rev. And I told the students up front, I said, look, I'm going to spend a lot more time in Hebrews than I am in Rev, because Rev comes at the end, and if we only get one class, that's fine with me.
Yeah.
But what you were just saying in terms of the way that we read it, the way that I would explain it oftentimes personally was I read Revelation like I was reading the letters of Paul.
Yeah.
I just took the same kind of interpretive grid and parameters and just applied it, just forced it onto Revelation. And now I have to read it literally like it's all literally true, even though I know I'm reading metaphor and similes and all kinds of things.
Well, right. Even though the text goes out of its way to tell you, right, that, the white garments are the righteousness of the saints. Like, we literally lacked the capacity to make that transition. Like, we couldn't calculate it. Like, we didn't have the aptitude for it. And on any front, not just with the Revelation, on any front, with the exception of sometimes in preaching, some other avenue would open up. And I think that largely had to do with our indebtedness to the Black Pentecostal preaching tradition and Black Baptist preaching tradition. So that even that was borrowed, I think, largely. But yeah, it made Revelation pretty much impossible to read well, because we didn't. It wasn't just a lack of willingness. Like, we genuinely lacked what it requires to read with skill, to read a text like that with skill. Because Revelation, as you know, is a kind of blending of styles and genres, right? And so you can get set up to read it like Paul's letters, because the book opens with a series of what look like letters, right? So it's easy to make that mistake. And some of the metaphors are explained as metaphors, and then some are not. What's kind of grotesque about it is that when we did try to make a connection, to see something as a symbol or as a code, we always went to something, like the image of the flying scorpions, or the scorpions that he envisions. We just connected that to like helicopters or fighter jets, right? Like, we couldn't think poetically about it. Like it wouldn't work on us. And I think it was because we utterly lacked that capacity. Sorry, I'm getting interrupted here.
Okay.
You hit my
I'm sorry,
phone
just-
halfway off and it really
Okay, just hold on. I'm sorry, baby. I'm very sorry. I'll be right there. Sorry about that, John.
That's okay. That's okay. It's an emergency. So, well, you've got someone back there waiting for you. So just a quick question, like just tell me what you're looking forward to about the panel and us trying to tackle this book that seems almost impossible for anyone to get a handle on.
Oh, well, because I actually think it is about Jesus, and it's about the Jesus of the Gospels, and it's glorious, right? And I think it is also a way of kind of facing our demons, so to speak. Like and this is to go back to what I said earlier about my colleagues, Chris and Melissa and Robbie and others. Like when a text has haunted you, I think eventually the Lord leads you back to it to say, let's look at this again. And that's what this feels like for me. And I think it will for many people, because this text has that kind of ugly history for sure, for many people, not for everyone, but maybe even for most people. I mean, it's a text that, and not just, I mean, we've talked about American evangelicalism today, but it's not limited to that. I mean, this is a text that has a long troubled history in terms of how it's been read.
Yeah. Even with the difficulty of it getting into the canon.
Oh, absolutely. Right. Yeah. From the word go.
Yeah.
It's a challenge. It's challenged and difficult and proved to be difficult right from the beginning.
Well, I'd like to explore this sometime too down the road, but I wonder the extent of the influence of the church adopting an Enlightenment culture, an Enlightenment way of thinking that actually, after generations, produced people that ended up having no imagination to think like about these metaphors in a poetic fashion, and instead thought of it more in the reason and intellectual fashion and all that. So
yeah, no, I think this is too simple, but something like this I think is really true. What happens is when you've got a population explosion, you've got an upsurge in life expectancy, you've got an upsurge in literacy rates, like basic literacy rates, the ability to read.
Right.
And you've got the breakdown of kind of traditional institutions, the church, the nation, the rise of the nation state and the collapse of kind of medieval economies and medieval political systems. So in the modern world kind of emerges with just a storm of new difficulties. And eventually one of the ways in which people backlash against that is a kind of simplistic approach to reading scripture, a kind of common sense, plain text reading that's as false to, and people often blame the reformers for this, but that's not quite fair. I mean, I don't think that Luther and Calvin and the others really are at fault for that, because they weren't arguing for this kind of plainness, right? I think it's more of a reaction against just being overwhelmed, right? Just the sense of everything, truly everything we thought we knew about the world turns out to have been convertible. And now all things are new, but not in a way that is hopeful or life-giving. And I think people are just overwhelmed. And one way of solving that overwhelmedness is to kind of recur into a kind of drastic simplicity. And that way of reading becomes the way that shapes American evangelicalism. That it's not the only way of reading, but it's the dominant way of reading. And it works better with some parts of the Bible than others, and it works really poorly with Revelation, right? Like that way of reading. I think it's a disservice to all of Scripture, because I think it's false to what it means to be human and false to the work of God in our life. But it's really, really bad way of handling Revelation. You might get by with handling Galatians like that, but you can't get by with handling Revelation like that.
Yeah. You end up with what we ended up with.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, Chris, thanks. I'm just thrilled and delighted that you're going to be able to be a part of this with us, and it's always great to have you. And so thanks
Thank you.
for your thoughts and your time this morning.